my right is Colin O'Malley. This is in tools for helping companies and individuals monitor their online privacy. Next to Colin is Randall Rothenberg. Randall is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, President and Chief Executive Officer, thank you, of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. And Randall also, many of you may or may not know, he's had a few lives. He was a management consultant prior to that, and prior to being a management consultant, he was actually the advertising columnist for the New York Times. So Randall has a long connection to both advertising and the New York Times. And next to Randall, we have Ed Felten. And Ed is here kind of wearing two hats. One, his current role is he is the chief technologist for the Federal Trade Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission, for those of you who may not be familiar with the inner workings of Washington, is that the branch of the executive part of our government that makes the rules and enforces some of the rules related to consumer protection and privacy sort of falls into that domain. So Ed has the perspective of a policymaker from Washington, and Ed also, when he's not serving at the, what do they call it, serving at the pleasure of the president or the chairman of the FTC, is also a professor of computer science and public policy at Princeton. So he brings both the academic perspective and the government perspective. Next to Ed, we have Marc Zwillinger. Marc is a lawyer. That's okay. He's a lawyer, and he advises companies on privacy and data issues as they relate to their business practices. And he also has an academic bent. He's a adjunct at Georgetown Law School. And then finally, next to Marc, we have Duncan Watts. And Duncan is the principal research scientist at Yahoo Research. And Duncan, prior to being at Yahoo, he was a full professor of sociology at Columbia, and he's researched behavior and many things. Duncan is an author of many works. His current work, I love the title, is called "Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer." So you can follow that, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean as well this evening. So thanks to all of our panelists. Whoops. Tonight's topic, as everyone knows, is privacy and personalization. So there's this inherent tension between privacy and personalization. As in the digital age, in the digital realm, I think we're all increasingly expect a much more personalized experience. But in order for us to have that more personalized experience, the various entities which are providing that experience, publishers, cable companies, you name it, movie services, all need to know a little bit of something about us. And in order for them to know a little something about us, that could potentially be something that is something we may want to keep private or not. So there's tension that comes between what they know about us and what we're willing to share with them, and what we get in return, and whether there's really anything to worry about in this or not. And that's sort of the essence of the debate. And as if on cue, on October 25th, today, the day that was earmarked for this event, months ago, the Wall Street Journal just happened to publish one of the latest installments in their ongoing series related to this topic, What They Know. I don't know how many of you have saw this or are familiar with this series, but I'll say a couple of things about this series. First, I'll say two things about this particular series that the Journal's been running. One is it has definitely gone a long way toward raising awareness of the issues that we're going to discuss tonight among thought leaders and business people and generally the influential people that do read the Wall Street Journal. The second thing I'll say is they've also, in addition to raising awareness of these issues, also raised what in my humble opinion, is some undue alarm related to these issues. And today's installment of this particular series is no different and really sort of fits the bill. I just wanted to point out a few things about it. The headline of this is "Using Credit Cards to Target Web Ads." And it begins with a rather bold assertion that says, the two largest credit card networks, Visa and MasterCard, are pushing into a new business, using what they know about people's credit card purchases for targeting them with ads online. Now, the rest of the article, for those of you who've read it, is a fairly extensive exposition that describes precisely that they actually aren't doing that. Even to the point of a scientist from MasterCard asserting that it's actually impossible to connect internet users with an analysis of their purchase histories as they're making purchases. So this series, has, as I said, raised awareness, but it's also raised a bit of alarm. And now let me turn to the raising awareness part, because they did do something in this article that I think is worth thinking about, and that is they unearthed a patent application that Visa has filed. And this patent application, it was published this year, describes how information from DNA databases, among other personal details, could be woven into profiles that are then used to target people online. So again, this isn't a practice that's going on, but it does show, perhaps, sounds kind of creepy, the limits and some of the edges of what might be going on. The series, or what might be possible, it's certainly not going on now. The series tends to imply that there's some personal transgressions going on that often aren't really going on, but might conceivably in some future universe be something we might have to worry about. So that sort of frames the major issues that I think we're going to touch on today. And I wanted to start by sitting down among my panelists here and kicking it off with a broad question that I'd like each of you to kind of answer. One is, I think it's fair to say that most consumers, don't have a full understanding and appreciation of what's going on with respect to data that's collected about them online. And I think the challenge for all of us is to kind of align people's understanding and expectations with the practices of business and industry. And so my question is, first of all, what do people really expect? And how can we bring these expectations to a point of understanding and then ultimately alignment? And I'll just go down the panel. So Colin, you're it.
Sure. All right. Thank you, Michael. So a couple of responses to that. One is that I think it's certainly true. I think we all know that most consumers don't understand the full extent of how we use data and the underlying mechanics that go into how we process it, where it's stored, which systems access it. And I'd also argue that it's not clear that most consumers should have to bother with understanding all that. It's two issues are often put together here that don't belong together. The assertion that most consumers don't understand the full extent of it is sometimes confused with an assumption that consumers don't have any understanding of what's happening. And that's generally untrue. All the data that we see on the extent to which consumers assume that tracking is happening, and that tracking is happening to customize advertisements, for example, to customize the content they see on the web. The majority of users in all the studies that I've seen are aware that that's happening. Now, if you press them for details, who it is, mechanics, etc., they can't answer that. But very similar to how you would ask them about, a food product, and you would ask them, where it came from and whether or not other third parties might be involved in the provision of the food, they would assume yes. If you press them for where those farms were, who the processors actually were, they would say, I haven't a clue. But again, you wouldn't necessarily say that they should be able to discover all that information, right? Now, because most consumers actually do understand that something is happening, they tend to be very skeptical about an industry that they see as not being transparent with them. And it's one of the reasons why we as an industry need to invest in the tools that allow us to engage in that dialogue with the consumer, to demystify the process to the extent that the consumer is willing to invest in the research to view the mechanics of what's happening behind the scenes. If we don't do that, then we're going to sort of persist in this marketplace where consumers presume the worst because they don't have a means of discovering what's happening behind the scenes.
Well, so why is nobody sitting in the front row here? I want to remain kind of private. Yeah. Oh, okay. I think there are two things. One is I have no idea what consumer expectations But I do know that there's a lot of survey research that is contrary to what behaviors would indicate. Survey research indicates people are very, very worried about various things, and behaviors indicate that people continue to use digital media and not take the various kinds of precautions to a great extent that they could be taking to protect their identity, their privacy, whatever. And we can talk about the difference, we probably should talk about the difference between identity and privacy. So I think that's just interesting. We kind of need to know more about, when we were talking about this a little bit before, need to know more about what people do know and don't know, what they expect and don't expect, and try and bridge that gap between what survey research tells us and what behaviors tell us. A second thing that I'd say is that, and I completely agree with Colin, so I want to kind of reinforce that there has been a vast communication gap. For those of us old enough to remember, the first flurry of great concern about this was in kind of the 2000, 2001 time frame when DoubleClick, which is then an independent company, announced its intention to buy Abacus, which is an offline direct marketing data company, and in a regulatory filing indicated that it intended to combine offline data files and online files. And this unleashed kind of a fury of concern and activity that led to various kinds of hearings in DC. The industry, which is a very baby industry at that point, very young, got together, formed an organization called the Network Advertising Initiative, did the right thing in terms of self-regulating itself, but then did very much a wrong thing, which is kind of wiped the sweat from its brow, said, wow, dodged that bullet, and then went underground, when what they should have realized at the time, that they should have begun an aggressive effort to continually talk to their consumers and their customers to educate them about what happens behind this black box. By not doing that and spending the better part of 10 years kind of not addressing this, they left a vacuum that a number of activists and advocacy groups could fill. And as you and I have discussed over the years, well, some of those groups are quite legitimate, and their interests and concerns are quite valid. A number of others have a very long-standing background in opposition to advertising generally and direct marketing quite specifically. So they filled that vacuum and inflamed kind of public fears, as Colin indicated. And if you think about it, a lot of the language that's used to describe things is, including, by the way, by industry, is scary language. I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that the reason behavioral targeting, which was a phrase that was invented by industry, because it seems so tantalizing to a marketer, that raises up the issue of CIA behavior modification mind control experiment.
The Wall Street Journal series is ominously entitled "What They Know."
And look, the phrases tracking and targeting come from hunting. So all these things, again, with the unwitting contributions of industry itself, have kind of raised these concerns and these issues because of this vacuum.
But behind that, there are some really some issues and some practices that we should take note of. So I have to pass it on to Ed.
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting, actually, on this topic of the sort of language and framing of these issues. It can be interesting to compare what the industry's messaging to consumers versus some companies' messaging to advertisers, which does talk in terms of laser-like targeting and so on. And I think there is actually, and I think the data shows that there is still a significant gap remaining between what consumers find, what consumers, knowing what they do know, which in a lot of cases is not that much about what's happening, what consumers would find acceptable versus what is actually happening in terms of information collection and use. Now, there is, I think, a process of education that needs to go on in both directions so that consumers can have a better understanding of the economics of advertising, marketing, and information collection on the one hand, and so that the industry can have a better picture, can get a better picture of what is acceptable to consumers, and so some sort of meeting of the minds can be reached. Because although I think there is a gap, I don't think that gap can persist forever. I don't think any kind of information gap like that can really persist. So I think we're early in the process of the industry and consumers coming to terms and trying to reach some sort of accommodation that is acceptable on both sides. Now, I also don't think we're going to get to that point by having consumers learn every last detail of how things work, because that's not the way we get to acceptable practices or product quality in other areas as well. Many of the products and things that we use and interact with are super complicated, and we as consumers don't want to have to learn everything about them. But you need to have some sort of system in place which involves things like standard practices in the industry and so on, in order to get to a point where consumers feel like, even if they don't understand every last detail, that, that the system is watching out for them. And the best way to get there is for industry to reach a point where they can say honestly to consumers that this is as far as we're going and we're not going across this line.
Before I was a Internet Information Security and Privacy lawyer in private practice, I was a computer crime prosecutor at the Department of Justice in the late 90s. And the Internet was sort of really getting going then. We're trying to figure out the right rules that would apply to emails and to web browsing and to communications over the Internet. And the standard thing we're always told is think about the right real-world analogy and then try to reason from that. And one thing that tends to get missed in these discussions, and has been missed so far in today's discussion, is we're talking about consumer expectations on the Internet without reference to what consumer expectations are in the physical world. I took a train up here from DC, I checked into a hotel, the hotel asked me for a copy of my driver's license. I said, what are you going to do with it? They said, oh, we're going to stick it in your file. I said, well, then what's going to happen to it? She's like, I don't know. I said, they said, why do you want to know? I said, well, it's my driver's license. It's got very sensitive information on it. What's going to happen to the file after I check out? Are you going to destroy it? She said, I have no idea. I'll see if I can find somebody who can give you an answer. But we engage in these real-world transactions all the time. We make travel reservations. We go places. We give credit cards over. We don't get a privacy policy back. We don't have an understanding of what happens to our information in the real world. In some ways, we have a better understanding of what happens in the Internet because of the requirements of our privacy policies. But what we layer on top of that now is social media. Because now it's not just we give our information to a website, we give our information control to other people. And again, I'm going to be the Vice President Biden and make everything an Amtrak analogy, but I was sitting on the train, and there was a guy sitting next to me, and we had a very nice conversation, and we talked about our kids and jobs and such, and he gave me his card. His name is Roger Wallach. He's at Morgan Stanley. And he didn't ask me what I was going to do with this card. He probably had some expectation I was going to put it into my contacts and maybe try to friend him on social media. And his phone number is 703-556-81. Probably didn't expect me to be reading it out loud in a TimesOpen privacy discussion. But we had no conversation. We had no mutual understanding about what to do with his information. He just gave it to me. So I just want to start by, we've got to think about all these things. We've got to think about the way we operate and then say what should we expect on the Internet that's different, more advanced, more sophisticated than what we expect in the real world.
So the disadvantage in going last is that all the sensible points have already been made. I'll try to sort of answer this from my assigned perspective as the social scientist here, and think about what's the right or the most useful research program that one could pursue if you wanted to sort of try and answer some of these questions. And I think the thing that I've always found really frustrating about the privacy debate, and it's been reflected in some of the previous comments, is that it's sort of it's conducted entirely in the abstract and out of context, right? So if you ask people, do you care about privacy? What do you think they're going to say, right? If you ask people, do you want corporations to retain information about you and track your behavior? Of course they're going to say no. But if you said, would you like the web to be completely dysfunctional, right? Would you like to not, would you like to have to sort of log in and click through sort of 3 pages of registration every time you try to perform every trivial action? They would say, no, that's ridiculous. I don't want to do that at all. So I think that the way forward is to make the question about how much should we care about privacy, what is the tension between personalization and privacy, something that is much more concrete and something that's much more in context, so that clearly there's a bad deal for consumers that's conceivable. If somebody is taking my DNA, my genome information, and then selling it to insurance companies so they can deny me coverage because I have I have some sort of genetic predisposition for a disease, and I get nothing in return for that, I probably don't want that, right? And at the other extreme, if somebody, if you ask me, can I have 3 sort of relatively benign bits of information about you that you'd probably put on your Facebook page anyway, and by the way, I'm only going to show you ads that you really are interested in, the products that you actually wanted to buy, and you're going to get fantastic deals on them, and I'm going to save you tens of thousands of dollars a year, I would probably say that's great, sign me up. And so, I think that in between is a whole kind of continuum of trade-offs between the value to the consumer and what the consumer is being asked to do and being asked to give up that needs to be explored. And this is, by the way, something that comes up a lot in scientific research involving human subjects. And I have some experience with this in universities and also at Yahoo. When we do experiments or studies involving human subjects, you have to explain to them what the relevant costs and benefits are, and what you're going to be doing, how it might benefit them, how it might harm them, and then they can either sign up for that or not. And I think that sort of principle of transparency, but one that is in context and very concrete, and is going to be different in across different experiences, is both the right approach and also sets out a very interesting research agenda of trying to sort of understand how we can draw these trade-offs so that actually everybody benefits. And I think that's entirely conceivable, that there are reasonable trade-offs that are good for the advertiser, good for the publisher, and good for the consumer, and we just need to find that.
Yeah, Michael, just to, one thing I forgot is there's also a lot of confusion around terminology here, so it's very hard to answer the question of expectations. I think we all know, and perhaps we've been seeing some research on this, that people have a tendency to confuse and conflate, or at least not distinguish, various things like data security, or even data, information, privacy, identity. So
yeah, I think we should touch on all those topics, but I want to pick up a bit of where the direction that Marc and Duncan were taking this a little bit, and get to sort of the concrete examples based upon the current state of play and the way we're handling the issues now, at least in terms of online behavioral advertising. So you raised the issue, Marc, of norms, and that poor fellow from Morgan Stanley certainly didn't expect to be, have his number read here in a panel, but he did have certain expectations about what it was that probably would happen when he handed you his business card, I guess the current state of play is that people, I'm going to just generalize a little bit, and people can edit my generalization here, but people expect that as we traverse the web, as we go about our business and our digital lives, that there are bits and pieces of information that we're leaving behind, and they're being scooped up here and there by different kinds of entities. And so the sort of norm I would propose that we've set out here is one where there's a means whereby that's disclosed, and that means is usually a privacy policy, and then there's some mechanism by which we can choose not to participate in these data events by opting out, let's say, and that seems to be sort of the state of play. So should the online norm of an expectation that pretty much everything is leaving a trace, and there is some method for me to erase that trace, at least, or not erase the trace, because that's going to raise a different issue. But let's say choose not to leave this particular trace. And should that be the norm? Is that the new norm? It's, is that the norm for online behavior, as just like the norm for business cards is that you're not going to do what you just did?
Well, if only we lived in that world. I think there are some information flows and some information gathering that people understand. If I go to read an online magazine article, I know that magazine finds out that I read that article. But there's not a disclosure to the typical user about who else learns that the user read that piece of information, nor about where that fact might go or be redistributed from there. Nor is there uniformly an opt-out mechanism that allows the user to prevent the collection and use of that information. There is an industry program that allows the user to opt out of the use of that information for the purposes of online advertising, but at least for me as a user, targeted advertising is the use of that information that I find most acceptable out of all the possibilities I can think of. In the sense that I don't mind seeing a targeted advertisement, but I do worry about the accumulation of that information. And we don't have the disclosure of who gathers that information. And in fact, often publishers themselves don't know who learns what people do on their sites.
One of the problems here is that we have a very poor mechanism of communicating with consumers about the information. We've had this privacy policy regime for a long time, and I have to be honest, I get hired to write very bad privacy policies. It's not that I can't write good privacy policies. I can. But the problem is if you don't have something in the privacy policy that somebody thinks should have been in your privacy policy, we live in a very gotcha world right now for companies where, if the FTC were the only game in town, it would be nice because the FTC says you no longer have to disclose common, routinely understood uses in your privacy policy. You don't have to wait pages and pages of saying, and we give the information to people who we need to give it to fulfill your request, and we give it to our third-party subcontractors who work for us. FTC says we don't have to say that. The FTC doesn't control all the plaintiffs' attorneys who've suddenly discovered that privacy policy gotcha is a game that's very lucrative for them, because if they can allege that something was done in a way that wasn't disclosed properly, and they can allege that and get into the discovery of a corporation's practices, that corporation is going to want to settle that case before people have to be deposed about all the things they do. So there's a privacy policy gotcha game, and with all due respect to the FTC, them saying don't do this anymore doesn't stop that. So then we put everything in the world in a privacy policy, and then it's not an effective way to communicate. So other people say, and I'll stop in a minute, other people say, well then put it in the flow. And then Duncan's point is, well, if every screen that you click on the screen that says, do you consent to the disclosure of the fact that you looked at the screen to the following 7 people and check back tomorrow because the 7 people might change, that's not a very good user experience either. So we haven't mastered the way in which we need to disseminate information to consumers. So telling companies, do it better, be more transparent, tell them more, doesn't always result in a better disclosure.
So I think Ed's point is an interesting one, bringing sort of the offline model to bear, to show a way in which the offline model actually may not be appropriate in its current state. And I don't know whether it is or isn't in that particular case, but I think the broader point that the fact that it is a certain way in the offline world doesn't mean that the online world should behave in the same manner is a very fair one, right? And so we do often draw these analogies, and they can be useful constructs, but they are seldom conclusive, right? I use the kind of silly analogy that sounds kind of incriminating, where I say, if I get into trouble with my wife, right, I can't really go back to her and say, yeah, but all the other guys I was hanging out with, they were on such worse behavior, right? So shouldn't my behavior, relatively speaking, be seen as permissible, right? I think that to a large extent in the online world we are living in a different framework where data flows at greater volume, to a greater extent, and the concerns about data proliferation, its availability across orders of magnitude more companies at the same time, many of which are small and maybe perceived to be unaccountable. All that needs to be taken into account. And then also there are certain folks that are very influential that would like to basically sort of reset the playing field a bit from a privacy perspective in the online world and get this one right, but the perception may be that certain things got out of hand in the offline world will have to be addressed separately. I also, just from a from an informational standpoint, I think that the regime or the current state that Michael, that you articulated, doesn't necessarily reflect where the marketplace, at least right now, has aspired to go towards, right? So
Can you create that vision for us,
Yes,
Cass,
well,
the marketplace aspiration?
Sure. So and again, it's an aspiration, right? So I think in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is a gigantic yacht that's being sort of redirected and beginning to advance in a new direction, not complete in its course yet. But we're clearly, I think, in part based on guidance from the Federal Trade Commission and as acknowledged in by the Digital Advertising Alliance and the trade associations like the IB that govern our industry. We've acknowledged that there are many forms of data collection and use that should not be disclosed in the privacy policy, right? And effectively have created a bit of a tiered system whereby, based on understandings that are beginning to develop about the relative sensitivities of different categories of data use, that they ought to be disclosed in a more or less proactive manner to the consumer, right? And there are certainly going to be a range of data collection forms that are going to continue to be disclosed in the privacy policy, but from the perspective of online behavioral advertising, the assembly of profiles across multiple websites not under common ownership, we've now decided as an industry that ought to be disclosed and disclosed in a manner that is proactive, comes at the consumer, and is concurrent with the actual event, right? And so the availability, the discoverability of information in a densely worded legalese document, that's no longer going to be held as sufficient. And that's the construct of the self-read program in the US. And that there are also, in addition, sensitive categories of information for which that kind of proactive notice is not sufficient because it still implies an out mechanism for obtaining consent, right? That certain categories, the example was just used of medical information, for example, that's used to deny insurance coverage, right? So that's clearly itemized in sort of a sensitive data category that would require prior consent. And so the industry has accepted that if we want to negatively target you based on your health information and an insurance category, we have to get your prior consent rather than doing it first and seeing if you have concern, right? But that's the construct that we as an industry are beginning to move towards. I think that at least here in the U.S., and maybe we can get to the EU in a bit, but I think that's the basis of a bit of a brokered understanding between regulators, advocates, and the industry itself on sort of what commonly accepted practices are and what level of interaction the consumer ought to have with information about those practices before they occur.
So I think as a principle, the transparency one is a good one, right? It would be nice to have a world, and I think we don't live in it yet, but certainly some parties are trying to get more in that direction, where at least we make it as convenient and easy as possible for people to understand the policies that they are agreeing to be able to go and see what companies know about them, and then have some control over whether that's retained or deleted and so on. Unfortunately, I think in practice, it's not going to help that much, right? Because, and I think there are the main reason is just, transparency is its own form of obfuscation, right? If all the information in the world is made available to you, it's actually, you're sort of stuck with the same problem, or a different version of the same problem. Right? You go from the scarcity problem where you don't know, the problem is that you don't know things, to the abundance problem, which is that you know too much and you can't make sense of it. And I think it's extremely difficult to think about all the services that you've signed up for in the last month, and how many of the terms of service agreements you've read when you clicked on the agree button. Nobody does this, right? And if you tried to do it, it would be overwhelming. And I think the same is probably true of this sort of imaginary database that we imagine, exposing to consumers, so that everything that everyone knows about them can be controlled. I mean, people can't even handle their Facebook privacy settings because they're too complicated. And they're actually not too bad when you go and look at them. They're reasonably sort of intuitive. There's just a lot of things to keep track of, and so you can customize them, but who does that, right? So So, this is just sort of the reality that we have to accept, that humans, have these cognitive limits, and so the system has to be designed to respect those, which brings me, of course, to the default settings, right? So then it becomes very, very important what the defaults are, and I think that is where, because 99.9% of all users leave the defaults the way they are. And so we have to be very, and there are ways to do this. I mean, there are sort of, there's experimental methods for, eliciting desirable defaults, and I think that's a program that could really help you.
We probably shouldn't get into this, but do you think that the World Wide Web Coalition is a good process for setting defaults?
I don't
The reason I'm asking, and I'm kind of joking, there is this organization called the World Wide Web Coalition, which actually sets technical standards around things like how browsers work, which is currently in the process of trying to implement technical standards for do not track in the browsers, which are fundamentally political decisions. But this is not a political or policy organization. So one of the debates that's been taking place recently there, which has been horrifying to me, is that they would like to, there is a group within this group that would like to effectively ban through the browsers opportunities for companies like the New York Times to deliver different user experiences to different people based on whether they're willing to accept advertising or not. And we're sitting there kind of wondering, among other things, about the antitrust issues and constitutionality of that, but more at a larger level, the idea of technical people trying to set political standards or cultural standards without having the background to do it. So it's just another layer of confusion in this process.
I guess I would urge you not to read too much into points made in debate by one or two people in a large group.
Fair enough, but my job is to worry.
So just one observation going back to the beginning where I started about making some assumptions on real world behavior. Sometimes we don't use the same common sense when we talk online, and default settings is an issue where I think that comes up. It seems inherently fair to have different default settings depending on the type of application you're using. Right? If you're using a social media application that's designed to publish information to some set of people, not necessarily the whole world, but there's some set of people that you are intending to publish information to, that is an act where you're intending to share something. The assumption is you've intended to share something, and so some set of defaults can be based on, the baseline assumption is you want people to know something about your behavior. Whereas if you're browsing an article online, or if you're actually having an experience where you're doing a transaction with Visa and buying something in a store, you've manifested no desire whatsoever to share that information, and your expression of it through an online checkbox or through changing a setting needs to be more clear. Whereas from the activity itself of joining Facebook, there's some presumptions made that you're intending to share, and so defaults don't need to be set the same on all the different applications. So look at the behavior.
Right. So let me bring this back to the applicability or not of the offline real world examples that you started with, Mark. Because this distinction between the online world and the offline world is becoming increasingly fuzzy, and the connectedness between the two is becoming almost ubiquitous. So if you could just take your example of the transaction at the hotel counter and just add this one twist to it. A new product is introduced into the marketplace that's marketed to hotels to assist in the check-in process. And as part of that new product, they take your driver's license, and instead of walking it over to some Xerox machine, they simply swipe it into this device. Now I think we're in a totally different situation, and the default settings and the norms in that situation need to be reconsidered. So my question is, how could you communicate those when now we're just adding that complexity? So how would you propose communicating those kinds of norms to consumers in a way that is reasonable and transparent?
Can I jump in, because I think it's a great way of phrasing it, and one of the things that actually got me into this, because you and I talked about it years ago, was a bill in New York State that I don't think exists anymore because the Assemblyman has gone, the Brodsky bill, which has written would have given consumers a right to opt out of the use of barcode scanners at retail checkout counters, even for cash transactions. So in other words, I mean, the way that this legislation was written was that in order to protect your privacy, you could require Duane Reade to not scan an item that you were buying, even if you were buying it for cash, which there's no way to identify you. Okay, badly written piece of legislation, we all know that. But that's one of those things where the quest to create a shield in the name of privacy can really screw up things like the national supply chain in consumer goods. So I think it's a very good way of looking at some of these issues, to apply kind of logic and real world examples, and also to look at much more intently and closely at what is the intent, what are we trying to protect, and therefore what are the most appropriate steps to protect that.
Okay, so Ed, did you want to comment on that?
Actually, I'll comment just briefly on this hotel analogy.
Okay.
From a consumer protection standpoint, the consumer's relationship with the hotel is something that is pretty useful, right? If you walk into a hotel and it turns out that they are actually sharing your information in a way that you don't like, you know what to do about that as a consumer. And that first-party relationship you have with the hotel is an important lever. It's much harder to deal with these issues if you're talking about someone who gathers information about you as you pass them on the street, where you don't have a relationship.
So let me come back to that in terms of the analogy of where we are, like in the industry right now, with respect to this self-regulatory regime and this hypothesis that maybe there is new norms that are taking hold. So if I can again sort of paraphrase it, and using the hotel example is a good one. You would expect, I would say, the average person, myself, would expect in that instance of the electronic scanner when you check into the hotel, that you have given some information to that hotel, period, full stop. And anything that went on beyond that would be something that would need to be disclosed. And that's sort of the framework that we've arrived at with this self-regulatory regime, in as much as the first-party relationships, the websites you visit, there's a presumption that those websites are going to know something about you and be able to do certain things with their product, to tailor the product, to personalize the experience. And there doesn't, that's sort of our hypothesis at least, is that's the expectation. The third parties who are ushered into these websites by virtue of, say, advertising or services that the websites contract with, those third parties need to be disclosed, and disclosed in a way that allows consumers to opt out. So that I think is the self-regulatory regime. Would you all sort of agree?
Except that it depends on what the third party is actually doing, right? So it wouldn't be the case that any third party with a scanning device at the hotel check-in would have to be disclosed. It depends on what that third party is actually up to and who's going to receive the data afterwards. So in other words, it's probably quite true that already we'd be checking into hotels where a third party is receiving the information, but provided that third party is fulfilling a function that we would reasonably expect, like processing the transaction, taking... Right.
They're doing it in service to the first party exclusively.
You got it.
Right, okay. So
but this is also where I think, transparency is I think we kind of left transparency in the dumpster in the last segment, and I think I want to pull it back a little bit. I think if you're looking at, there are a range of activities clearly that are unexpected enough, but potentially intrusive enough, that you need to gather prior consent before you even proceed.
Right.
There are a range of practices that are so expected that maybe some kind of obscure notice that is discoverable only to the most especially interested and investigative, maybe the notice can sit there, right? But now we have this entire range of middle practices,
right,
that covers everything from basic research and analytics and ad optimization to detailed profiling that is collected and appended and leveraged by hundreds of different organizations, all of which is somewhere between can't happen until I prior opt-in and maybe I have to dig deep to find it. In that middle layer, that's where transparency really needs to take hold. And I think that we really, as an industry, do ourselves a tremendous disservice if we view transparency as the opportunity to throw opt-in dialog boxes in front of terms of service. right? That transparency meant pounds of legalese. And in many ways, I think this was the challenge that Randy was issuing in the very beginning, which was that the industry kind of got that wrong. And they got it wrong for about 10 years. And they said, you know what? As long as we have a discoverable notice and it's pounds of legalese, then we will be covered, and we don't need to actually invest in a direct dialogue with the consumer.
So now,
the designing transparency mechanisms that are actually useful and not sort of obstructionist, which clearly can happen and is happening today, is really a UI challenge, and it's a challenge that needs to be adopted not just by the lawyers in an organization, with all due respect, but by product designers, marketers, folks that actually are handling features, controls that real people actually understand and utilize.
Duncan, so I agree again with the principle and I don't think I put transparency in the dumpster. I think it's at worst it's a necessary condition. But having designed experiments where I am desperately trying to convey information to the user, one thing I have learned is that people do not read anything. Anything. If you have 2 sentences of instructions, they will not read it, okay? So, it's really staggering, how maybe, I'm not a very good UI designer, and I absolutely think that it could be done better, but I think that the cognitive constraint here is severe, right? I'm not saying that we should not strive for transparency. I'm saying that is not sufficient, right? That we cannot assume that because we have done an outstanding job of giving a simplified, easy to understand terms of service, because we have an easily discoverable and navigable and editable database that then people are in control, because I still think that most people are not going to do any of those things, and so we're still left with the problem.
Let me take this to the case of the current regime again. I'm determined to ask this question, and it's great to have such a lively group. But the question is this: we've had a year now when we've had this little UI element on third-party targeted advertising that appears right within the ad, the Power Eye, I believe it's called, and the Forward Eye, excuse me. We've got some experience now with this method, and it's a method that's designed pretty elegantly. A lot of people weighed in on it. It took into account a lot of these things. So how's it going? What have we learned? What's happened? I put that question to you as a company that's serving it, to you as the FTC regulator, to you as the industry head, and to you guys as observers of this phenomenon of human behavior.
Well, so I don't know why Duncan's been struggling with UI design for privacy disclosures when the rest of us have solved it.
Who solved it?
Yeah, I think clearly huge challenges there, right? And I think to address the question specifically, you're right. We're 12 months into this experiment that we're embarking in as an industry of investing in a dialogue that's bringing transparency forward to the consumer. In a lot of ways, we have moved mountains with respect to the progress we've made. If you look at where we were a year ago and the standards that were distributed across the industry were effectively, again, this privacy policy-based disclosure world, without anything specific in the area of sensitive data. Those standards have now been fully adopted. We have this singular icon that the entire industry is investing towards developing recognition of within the consumer demographic. Evdon alone, as the leading technology platform behind these icons, has delivered over 90 billion of them in the last year. We touch about 80 million US web viewers every day with respect to sort of enhanced notice available on ads. So we passed this sort of point of being like the tip of the iceberg, that very first tip of the bell curve. And we're moving now towards some semblance of mainstream adoption, to the point where other folks around the world are looking at this model that we've adopted in the US as a model. When you look at interaction, I think there are a couple lessons you can draw from that as well. The opt-out rates are very, very low, right? So folks within the industry that are terrified that you're about to lose audience, you won't.
Numbers?
Sure, so again, about 90 billion icons served in ads in the last year The opt-out rate is 0.0002%. Right, so it's quite low. Now what's interesting, were you talking about click? I mean, when you compare it,
clicked on one of those things.
well, what I was,
How many of you ever seen one?
Who's clicked on one of these things? Okay, so that's why the opt-out rate is so low.
Now, in fairness, 3 of those hands were from Evanon employees in the back there. Now, but I think this actually highlights a very important point, and you can look at that opt-out rate from a number of different directions. One that is frequently cited is not enough people are interacting with that icon, right? To which we would say, listen, the average user is looking at what, 2,000 display ads every week. We have Ghostery employees that run Ghostery that see 1,100 Google ads a week from Google alone, right? So the notion, we still have to sort of reset this framework instead of using a marketing metric to evaluate the success of a privacy notice, a click-through rate. It's kind of absurd to think that the typical consumer, about 2,000 times a week, really ought to be investing in a dialogue about how each ad is leveraging their data, right? And I think this is, again, one of the challenges that we have when we look at broad mainstream engagement stats, and we use that as a mechanism for understanding what a privacy tool should be and how much detail it should go into. Because the reality is that most consumers do not invest in the time, but that doesn't mean those that, I'll put it a different way, those that actually do invest the time are a self-selected audience of much more interested, much more engaged people. And if we use lessons from the mainstream population to cater to the self-selected audience of folks that actually care enough to dive in, we end up developing UIs that have very little transparency, very little depth, and can't satisfy the most skeptical among the population.
I think the answer to your question, Michael, is it's actually gone extremely well.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah, well, as I said, my job is to worry and my job is to advocate. But I also think if you consider that, we've all agreed, industry went underground for the better part of 10 years and said nothing. And now we've kind of forcibly dragged industry into the light to develop a program that actually allows people to find out things and to act in their own interests, not necessarily as perfectly as the ultimately designed technical system could be. But that's not really the point here. The point was largely to organize hundreds and hundreds of companies into doing the right thing on behalf of consumers, and that is exactly what has taken place over a difficult period. They're doing the right thing.
Right, with a system that is relatively easy to implement across broad sectors.
All the largest third parties, all of them without exception, are involved in this. Large marketers, large media agencies, the largest, hundreds of them are now involved in it. As Colin said, this icon is becoming ubiquitous. It is there for people to look at and to link to. As Duncan indicated, these kinds of things are not the best mechanisms, but you know what? Over time, it becomes accretive. The warning on cigarette packs now been there for almost 50 years, I think. Listen, lots of people still ignore it. Lots of people, it becomes so ubiquitous it's ignored. But I don't think there's anybody on earth who doesn't understand, or anybody in the United States at least, who doesn't understand that smoking can cause cancer, and so to smoke is a choice that you're taking that risk. Over time, whether it's this icon or whether it's the way the program develops, this kind of knowledge will become accretive, will develop better ways. People will have the information that will allow them not just to protect themselves, but to learn more, which I think is really the larger and greater point.
So Ed, I think as you're in your capacity, I think we're quite interested in hearing the answer or your view on how this is working so far.
Sure. I guess if I had to give a grade, sort of mixing my FTC and university roles, and actually this would be a good time to point out that I'm not here as a spokesman for the FTC. I'm speaking for myself. But if I had to give a grade, I'd say incomplete.
Okay.
I think it is. It's certainly been a very good thing that the industry has organized itself and has had a serious discussion about the topic and has mobilized technical resources toward putting in place the system that's there now. But having said that, there are, I think, still some issues that ought to be resolved with the current system, and we've had conversations about this before. Let me point to three things. First of all, the user experience. Certainly, the icon has been displayed in many places, and if your metric is display of the icon, then you have these graphs that go up and up. But the user experience that the user gets after clicking the icon is often inconsistent and confusing. Try it sometime. Click the icon and then look for the how to get to the opt-out of everything button from there. It's often several clicks and often not obvious how to get there. And non-uniform, depending on which advertiser's ad you happen to click on the icon from. That's number one. Number two is the question of what is it that the industry is refraining from doing if the user does opt out. Currently, it is an opt-out of the use of collection and use of information for the purpose of targeted advertising. But collection and use for other purposes is not covered. And I think it's those other uses that are the most sensitive ones for consumers. And this again is something that the industry I know is talking about. And the third one has to do with simply the and this one is maybe for the developers in the crowd. Technical issues around how this is implemented. There are some real engineering challenges that come from having a separate opt-out cookie for each of something like 110 different ad networks. So that means if you click the opt-out of everything button, you have to get about 110 different third-party cookies deposited in your browser in a matter of a couple seconds. And if anything goes wrong, the user experience quickly gets inherently complicated. And I think it's difficult to deal with some of these technical issues with how the opt-out is delivered, the fact that if cookies are deleted, it goes away, and so on. I think it's difficult to deal with that without having some kind of a presence in the client, in the browser. And again, I know this is something that the industry is working to address. And hence, even though I think there are still some pretty significant problems, it's incomplete and not FD or even C-.
The one thing I was going to add, and you asked...
Could be leading to an A.
Or an A.
It could lead to an A, absolutely.
The question is, what privacy problem are we trying to solve at any given moment? And for those of us who have been around for a long time, we always argued that serving relevant targeted ads was a consumer benefit, not a consumer harm, and that consumers wouldn't particularly care if their ads were more targeted. In fact, they'd prefer it. And so the fact that we're solving the problem of why am I seeing this ad? Oh, you're seeing this ad because we got this information from here, or here's why, doesn't address some of the main concerns that Ed's raising. What are you doing with the rest of my data? Where is that stored, and what's happening to, are you actually collecting my mouse overs? If I'm using Verizon Fios and you're doing my triple play, is what I'm doing online affecting the ads I'm seeing on TV? I mean, we're solving a particular privacy problem, and it's not an important one necessarily, because people said it was. But I never believed it to begin with. I didn't think it was the privacy problem of the decade, is why am I seeing this ad?
But that's why, it's this debate got distorted, and distorted very early during that 10-year vacuum period by a set of people who really were anti-advertising and anti-democratic capitalism. And I know, listen, I'm sorry, but I gotta call them the ways I see them. I'm a progressive liberal Democrat from the New Jersey suburbs, living in New York City now, so even more of a progressive liberal Democrat. But it drives me crazy, and has driven me crazy from the beginning of this, to read some of the statements that very vocal advocates have made, which are profoundly about the destructive effects of advertising. Now, it's this advertising that supports institutions like this, which I happen to adore, and supports also shows like all those kind of prison reality shows that my wife likes, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the way so that's really why this got pulled in that direction, rather into some more profound and important conversations about government intrusion, around data loss and data security, around financial records and health records. I mean, that's where we should be focusing, and not on targeted advertising, for God's sake.
I think everybody who I spoke with on the panel expressed sort of a similar point of view, that serving relevant ads isn't really the problem here. In fact, I found that Chairman Leibowitz at the FTC said that that much of the data transferred to third parties is used for targeted advertising, which could be beneficial or at worst innocuous, but it can then move to an invisible lattice of companies snowballing into an exhaustive profile of you available to those making critical decisions about your career, your finances, your health, your reputation. So what are the real threats to privacy that we should be worried about, and how can we start to tackle them?
Well, I'm not sure how real it is, but I can tell you, it's easy to project what people are probably concerned about if they dwell on it, and should be concerned about. First of all, I think we can state outright what is often the number one undercurrent of all these conversations. A lot of men look at porn online and they don't want that to get out there. Okay, that really motivates a lot in this case. Secondly, and much more seriously than that, what you don't want to have happen in an advertising or a media environment is the fact that you're looking up articles about AIDS or cancer or clicking on ads for medications, and to somehow have that surfing history get back to an insurance company that then denies you insurance because of the kinds of media consumption behaviors that you're involved in. Those are the kinds of things that are legitimate.
So if those things go on, aren't we already protected? Wouldn't the FTC sort of step in if they found that something like that was going on? I'm asking you legal type.
Right, so as a non-lawyer and non-spokesman for the FTC.
It was a non-question, don't worry.
No, there is something maybe slightly informative I can say, which is that the FTC will act when the agency thinks the law has been broken, that the FTC does not have a general hunting license to punish all badness. There are things that can happen that are not against the law, or that are not against the law that the FTC is empowered to enforce, which I think all of us in this room would say we're wrong. So although we do everything we can to enforce the law, it's not the sole, it can't be the sole defense against badness.
So I am a lawyer, although I'm not your lawyer, which is a disclaimer I need to make. But I think Ed's right that the Sears case that the FTC did shows this principle more than anything else, which was Sears had a program where if you downloaded a certain toolbar to your computer, that you would get some benefits in the Sears program, and Sears would get the benefit of collecting all sorts of data about what you did online. And the Sears program was, I'll use the word disclosed to describe it without an adjective, it was disclosed in the terms of service of the toolbar, and it was in there that it would get access to all of your information. But the idea that it was getting banking information and health information and picking up all this from the toolbar was so unreasonable, according to at least the FTC complaint, that it would be hidden that way and not disclosed in a more upfront way to consumers so they can understand it, that it prompted the FTC to do an investigation of Sears. And that has been a guiding principle for the lawyers in the field for a while, that certain uses of data are so beyond the expectations of consumers that if you're going to do that, then you need to do something in the flow and separate from the lengthy privacy disclosure, which takes me to where I wanted to go, since I can go back for a second, which is that, I think one of the issues in 2011 is that, to me, this is the privacy year of the restaurant. The most important thing in restaurants and privacy are the same this year. It's location, location, location. All of the case that I've been involved in, and the interesting questions have been what to do with consumers' location data. What can you do with it? What's the right thing to do vis-a-vis the government, and what's the right thing to do vis-a-vis disclosure to third parties and to other consumers? And hopefully we'll get.
I think actually that's exactly where I wanted to go, because I wanted to come back to the incomplete grade we're getting here, and say that we're moving awfully fast, and we're moving awfully fast. Things are changing very rapidly. How many in the audience are developing mobile apps of one form or another? This is where the world is headed, and I think that our predisposition as an industry is to transfer, sort of drift the principles and terms that we've painstakingly have developed after this 10-year hiatus of paying attention that Randall alluded to, into the mobile space. But At the same time, the mobile space seems to be a little bit different in a few very fundamental ways. One is that, you know, we have pretty precise association between a device and an individual, which isn't the same when you're talking about a computer. And we have not only that precise connection between an individual and device, but we know where that device is, and therefore we know kind of where that individual is. So what kind of systems should we be thinking about now before it's too late in the mobile space?
Well, I'll start with just an observation about mobile, which is we are completely schizophrenic about our feelings about mobile data. And before we design a system, we have to figure out, again, what the baseline is, what expectations are. You know, in one sense, we really feel like we have this tracking device in our pocket, and every time we go anywhere, it logs in whether or not we make a call. Sometimes the GPS information, if it's on, will be constantly reporting back. And when the government wants access to that, when the government asks the provider for access to historical cell information or GPS data, that feels very intrusive. And we want the government to have a really strong showing. This isn't something they should be able to get with a subpoena. There's this feeling in the privacy community that should almost be as sensitive as content, and the government should need a warrant. On the other hand, we are sharing more location data about ourselves than we ever did, between mapping my run and mapping my bike and checking it in Foursquare and fighting to become a mayor of a coffee shop. And it's automatic check-ins, and we're constantly pumping that data out, and we never did that before. So right now, we're in this very gray area where if you're going to use location data for any unexpected way, and serving a coupon on the spot might not be an unexpected way, but if you're going to use it in an unexpected way, that's an area of great concern, and looking for disclosures within the flow as opposed to hidden in a privacy policy is one system to put into place on location data before location data gets too far out there.
I mean, I think actually, just to answer this question and also the previous one about what's the big thing to worry about, I think, again, speaking, and I'll take its cue here, speaking as a sociologist and certainly not for Yahoo, what I've found so interesting and a little bit scary over the last sort of couple of decades is how digitization is sort of, really upending our unspoken assumptions and unthought assumptions about how the world works. And your business card example from earlier was you just never even thought about what people did with the information that you gave them, because in practice there really wasn't much that they could do about it. And this is several years ago, my friend, a friend of mine, Jonah Peretti, who used to work at IBM. They did this fun little, one of the early sort of Google mashups, and they put publicly available data about presidential campaign donations. They mashed it up with Google Maps, and they called it Fundraise, I think. And so it was very popular because you could go to this website and look at people in your building and see how much they've donated to different presidential candidates, and this really freaked people out. But of course, this data had been public all along. It's just that nobody could be bothered going down to the local council offices and getting and digging through the files. And so nobody really, it wasn't like that was anybody. No one was trying to violate anybody's privacy. It's just that it became technically possible to digitize records that had previously been just paper, and it seemed like a sensible thing to do at the time for various other reasons. And then it had this sort of completely unintended consequence, because somebody came along and innovated and did something else with it that wasn't expected. And we've seen this happen with music, with IP. Presumably making mixtapes for your girlfriend is illegal, right? But it never mattered because it was too onerous to, make 1 million of them, right? It's always been illegal to, copy and steal secret government records. But, now you can, and this is what WikiLeaks has been, and all WikiLeaks is doing is something that people have been doing all along. But now you can copy, hundreds of thousands of documents and send them out sneak them out on a single disk. So it's not totally transformed that particular area of concern. And I think the same thing is going to happen in mobile as well. That all these clever people in this room are going to think, oh, this thing is technically possible and it's cool and I'm going to do it, and then the next thing you know, we're going to be thinking, how come I can't erase the record of my life that I've left online with all the sort of embarrassing consequences. Sorry, just one more thing. I read this sort of interesting column a couple of years ago, and it sort of really kind of stuck with me because this was sort of, for many of us, the transition of leaving high school and going to college is really a chance to reinvent yourself. Like, that you sort of, I had probably had a miserable time in high school, and I couldn't wait to get out of there, and I got to college and I got to start all over again. And you sort of have to wonder if that's possible anymore.
Yeah, there's a quote that I found recently from Reputation Defender, this business that some of you may know about. There's startups now that are trying to help people erase their digital presence because they've grown up and realized that some of the things in their past aren't things they want to have revealed. And the guy said, that Michael Zimbalist, the founder, said, the right to self-definition has always been among the most beautiful of American ideals. Beyond losing our right to identity, are we losing control of our identities? I mean, are we, it used to be like this expression, forgive and forget, right? So now, nothing is forgotten, and often the worst thing people have done in their life is the first thing people find out about them through this like digital presence that seems to be eternal. So can we reinstate forgetting? Is that reasonable to think that that's possible?
Well, but you run into, it's a very interesting, fascinating philosophical discussion, literary discussion. It's the basis of a lot of American literature. Great Gatsby, Sister Carrie. But how appropriate a topic is it for public policy? And that's where I kind of cringe, because there's now an emerging kind of legal theory that would allow people the right to erase things about themselves. And I wonder, well, what does that do to, for example, the New York Times archives and things like that? I mean, because the way this is progressing, and the way a lot of this discussion progresses, is it presumes that everything has a public policy solution. And not everything has a public policy solution. A lot of things have an emerging cultural solution. And I get very worried, very, very worried about what kind of babies we throw out with what kind of families.
Go ahead, Ed. Do you want to say something about it?
No, go on.
No, I was going to say, so it's really interesting. So there's potentially public policy solutions, there's potentially technical solutions, and then ultimately, I think one of the things we're getting to here is we need to find cultural solutions, some sort of new norms and new expectations that maybe are going to take the 50 plus years of the warning on the cigarette pack. I like that analogy, sort of accretion of understanding that comes with it. But I want to just ask, for the technologists in the room, is one of the ideas that's been bandied about, is a technical solution, not a public policy solution. The idea that somehow data can have an expiration date. That just like a gallon of milk is only good for a little while, this particular data point about me can be used, for the next 30 seconds and then it's gone. Or how feasible, how realistic is a technical solution like that?
Well, you can always put an expiration date next to anything, but how you would make that stick and whether, as a matter of public policy, you would want to make it stick is a whole other question. Certainly, if the information gets copied, if it's in multiple hands, in order for it to go away, all of those parties would need to cooperate. And if you're talking about forcing people to forget things they know under all circumstances, now you need to start talking about the First Amendment, you need to start talking about other really important public values. So I don't think that there's, even to the extent it is technically possible, which I think is limited, I think it's pretty problematic from a public policy standpoint to try to do this, at least to try to do it broadly. You can imagine something that's more limited. You can imagine this as a feature that some company might offer to their customers.
Yeah, I think it's just an immensely complex area. So I'll just give my high school example again. That before Facebook, it was still the case that all the people you knew in high school remembered you, and maybe they had some bad stories to tell about you, and they didn't like you very much or something. It's just that didn't matter, right? But in practice, it didn't matter because those people couldn't tell everybody else in the world what they know, right? And it was too much trouble, right? And now it's easy, right? In fact, it's effortless. And so they're not doing anything that they couldn't have done before. So you can't, in some sense, say they can't do it, right? You can't make them forget it. All you're doing is just sort of changing a mode of communication. It's like, well, how is this different from introducing telephones? It's just another way of people communicating with each other. And yet, it does fundamentally change things because, suddenly the scale, like every individual can now communicate with, 10 million others. And so it's actually, to me, it's not at all clear what the right, forget about whether we're talking about policy or technology, it's not even clear what we should do.
Well, there are some technology solutions that can come at the problem in a different way. And I guess maybe it's a slightly different problem, but one of the reasons we're so concerned about our data being out there on the internet now is that data is used to authenticate us to organizations that don't know us other than by that data. In the world of real-world authentication, we used facial recognition or we hand over some sort of authentication credentials. The internet, it's a combination of details about you that everybody has, and then when those details get out, you're worried, your primary worry is either it embarrasses you that the disclosure got out, or those same credentials can be used to create accounts in your name, get into your other accounts, change all sorts of things about you. So if we had a stronger authentication process, if we didn't try to make things so consumer friendly that we rely on weak authentication for all these things that matter to us, then the danger of our data getting out is less serious to us. Because yes, it's still the, yeah, I drank too much at a party and the picture up on Facebook and I can't do anything about that, but the credentials that Facebook have that hack don't get them into my online banking account and they don't get them into my other online accounts and ruin the rest of my reputation. So there are some technology solutions on the authentication side that I think solve the privacy problem, even though it's not immediately apparent that it's the privacy problem they're solving.
Yeah. Let me just point out one thing to add to this, which is that many of the sorts of services that we might worry about do in fact give you the opportunity to delete your account and make everything go away, just as a matter of customer service. And so if you want to have that picture of you on Facebook gone, then Facebook says that you can delete your account and it will be gone.
Okay. So let's bring this back down to.
Actually, wait, is that no? That may not be quite true because if somebody comments on that photo, right, who owns that comment, right? I think this is actually an issue that they have to resolve, and I'm not sure that it has been resolved yet. So it gets sort of complicated once people start interacting around the information because then it's unclear who really owns it. Yeah.
You're right, it is complicated if someone makes a copy of that, for example.
Yeah, there's copies of that that could be floating
But
around.
in any case, there is some attempt at least to do some amount of deletion when the user asks for it.
So let me ask one more kind of futuristic question, just going beyond mobile, and then we'll bring it back to brass tacks and some practical information, and then take some questions from the folks here. So mobile phones becoming ubiquitous. We're walking around with these little devices that are beaming our presence over. In addition to that, cameras are becoming ubiquitous now, and pretty much anybody anywhere can be taking our pictures without our knowledge, without our consent, and those pictures are immediately connected. And I read somewhere recently about a student at Carnegie Mellon, I think it was, who walked around the campus and randomly was snapping pictures of people, and in 25% of the cases, he could, via a various means of facial recognition software and Facebook, actually find the social security numbers of 25% of the people whose pictures he took around campus. So this idea that we can look at these old world norms as applying to this new world of ubiquitous digital information flowing freely and being able to be computed upon just may not hold. So are we headed toward a new view culturally, globally, of what privacy means and what we should expect?
I find that example particularly provocative because in this case, normally we sort of think of privacy as like the government versus the citizens or corporations versus consumers. But here it's just people versus people, right? It's totally egalitarian. And again, you could, when you had Polaroid cameras, you could have done the same thing that this person did. It just wouldn't matter, right? You had all these pictures in your old photo albums of random people that you were in the background of your photos, and it just didn't matter. But now it may matter, and I think there was this great example recently from the riots in Vancouver, where the young couple were canoodling on the street, and the guy turned out to be Australian, actually. He's from Perth. Within 24 hours they'd been identified. I mean, that just blew me away. And this didn't require any sort of FBI database or sort of sophisticated tracking. People just put it up on. It just went viral, as they say, and the next thing you know, the guy's parents are like, oh, that's Fred. What's he doing there? Who's that girl? I just, who could have imagined that would happen 5 years ago?
Let me just give a very quick plug at this point for the FTC's upcoming conference workshop on facial recognition and privacy, which will be in early December in Washington. You can check our website if you're interested.
Cool. I'll give a plug. Those are actually very interesting. Those workshops are always interesting, even if you're not a law student.
So let me just ask one final question, and then we'll take some questions, and I'll direct it to you, Colin. Let's get back to basics here, and just give the folks in the audience, many of whom are developing mobile apps, mobile websites, give us some kind of best practices for data collection, data storage, data retention, sort of the current state. What do you advise as a person working for a company that's really innovating in this space? What are some best ideas that they should be taking away from this?
Sure. So maybe I'll actually start from the philosophical piece and then go back to the practical piece. I mean, I think that there is a very interesting question now with the proliferation of data and what that means. We're talking about it really from the perspective of the individual, what it means for an individual's for privacy and what the sort of new set of expectations that a person has. I think it's pretty clear that if anybody tells you that we're in the same world from a policy perspective, they would be wrong. And also, if anybody tells you that they know what that emergent norm is, they would also be wrong, right? And that if one thing is clear, it's not a particular set of solutions that companies need to adopt to immediately make this clear and give control to the consumer, because that we're just not there yet. But that you can't refrain from the dialogue, right? If you refrain from that dialogue, you'll be run over. You'll be run over by the press. You'll be run over by regulators in multiple jurisdictions. When you talk to, we talk to regulators in the U.S., in the EU, sort of around the world. In many cases, you get these quotes from them that say things like, you need to be transparent about X and X practice. And then you ask them, well, what exactly does that mean? And they say, I'm not sure, you have to innovate, right? And so many companies take that to mean, oh shoot, that sounds really complicated. I wish I had more specific guidance, and until I get it, I'm going to do nothing, right? And it's the exact wrong response, right? Because if it was flipped and the regulator came back and said, I know exactly what you need to do, and in fact, here, I've designed the interface, right? Nobody would be happy. Certainly not the company, certainly not the consumer, right? With all due respect, right? But despite all the competence that the FTC and other regulators have, UI design and product innovation is just not the highest on the list, right? They really need the folks that are in the room to be thinking about this dialogue, to be investing in tools to come clean on it. And it's again one of the reasons why I think it's really a tragedy that some folks in the industry come to the conclusion that because it's hard, because most folks don't seem on the consumer side to invest in the time to work with my tool, that therefore I am somehow not encumbered with the obligation to be innovative in that space.
Can I ask you a question? Actually, I'd love to ask everybody a question, and this is honestly, it's not falsely naive on my part. When the iPhone first came out, this relates to your mobile question, Michael, and I remember the first time, hitting an app, and then the permission screen came and said, this application would like to use your location data, is that okay, or not? And I found that to be very elegant and very simple, and fairly straightforward. I guess, is it straightforward? Is it elegant? Is it simple? Is that a model? I'm not sure it can apply on the kind of the desktop online world, but I'm wondering if that's a step in the right direction.
Well, certainly, although let me just echo Colin in saying that we don't want to design your user interface. We have enough work already, and we do think you're probably better at it than we are. But certainly, thinking cleverly about the design and trying to come up with a user experience that makes it evident to a user, sort of at an intuitive level, what's happening is kind of the goal. And here's an example of a really good design, is the little red light next to the camera on a computer that comes on when the camera is on, right? That's dead simple. Everybody knows intuitively what it means. And if you design the system so that the red light must come on when the camera is on, which, by the way, not everybody does, but if you do it that way, then you've gotten an important privacy disclosure in a way that is not going to annoy the user and isn't buried in a policy somewhere. To me, that's kind of an example of the kind of elegant design that you want. And to the extent that you can make these things obvious as part of the experience, you'll win. Whereas if users are surprised and angry after the fact to learn something about what's happening, then you're not doing the job right.
Just to echo that point, I'm a big fan of the forced choice model when people register. There's a lot of people who say you can't force a user to read something, right? You said that earlier, Duncan said it well. 2 sentences they won't read. But when you try to fill out a registration field and you leave out a required piece of information and you try to continue and it won't let you continue, that's not a frictionless experience. It does slow you down. You do go back and fill in that field. And companies will do that about a piece of data they have to have. Like if they have to have your zip code, they have to have this, you've got to fill it out. And if you took advantage of that registration moment to have a single forced choice, and that's usually a public-private choice or some sort of choice at that moment, I don't think you can be questioned later by anybody. You had no defaults, the user had to make a choice, and maybe that choice stuck with them for longer than it should have. But it does help. And just to make this point with a little more humor, but it's the same point, you know, Colin said his wife doesn't look to how the behavior of other men when they go out as an example for how he should behave, but the law actually does. The law does look to how other people behave. And so my story that I always tell is about the hikers who go hiking in the woods and they're wearing hiking boots, they're very clunky, and one of them bends down and starts to put on sneakers, and the other one says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm putting on sneakers. I heard there was a bear in the area." He said, "Well, you're not going to be able to outrun a bear." He says, "I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you." So to the extent you're doing something innovative and novel, and like your Zynga, and you put up a privacyville game that forces people to play a game in order to get their privacy policy, that's innovative and new. It tends to do forced choice. All these things are going to help you when you come to me and say, "Hey, defend me." You know, they're going to be the kinds of things that you can't be challenged. You had this great, innovative new model that's better than what other people are doing.
Okay, great, thanks. Did you want to?
Well, a couple of practical things. I was going to.
Then I want to open it up to questions.
Sure. Well, so some practical things I think for developers in the room. I mean, first of all, many studies have been done sort of assessing the extent to which applications have privacy policies. Numbers are very, 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 very low. How many your privacy policy?
Okay. Question.
How many folks here have? Appropriate question with that in the room. But how many folks in the room have are developing applications? Do we have that? Show of hands again. And then how many folks actually have privacy policies? Can we? Yeah. So I mean, that's actually not bad as far as most of these sort of informal polling mechanisms go. I would just underscore the importance of making sure that you have that kind of contract in place with your users. There are some great free resources you can take advantage of. You know, Jim Rock has this site Privacy Choice that has a great starting guide and sort of a form set that you can use to begin to set a privacy policy. There are also principles of data minimization, and there's this sort of question about the incremental value of the data that you're collecting in an environment with an explosion of data. We've talked about it from a personal perspective, but from a corporate perspective or an app developer perspective, you can also look at it as, well, in an environment where everybody has a lot of data, what is the value of the data that I'm actually collecting here? And is it necessary for the business, the commercial purposes that I have? And is it worth sort of the decrease in trust or increase in intrusiveness that I might undertake to collect that data? There's a general principle of data minimization here, from the app developer's perspective that just says, listen, if you don't have a real application of the data, don't contribute to sort of the proliferation on that end. And the last piece is there's a real difference in challenge between the first parties on the app side and the third parties, right? In terms of the mechanics of gathering consent or providing notice. And it's always the classic case that when we look to find really good intuitive experiences for gathering notice, the first thing we do is we say, hey, this large company that has a first-party relationship with the consumer, they do such a great job of sort of presenting notice that is intuitive and makes sense. They have an opportunity to force you to take an action. The challenge is that third parties, in particular advertising networks, and frankly, many of the folks in the room here are going to rely on to monetize their applications if you're involved in sort of advertising as a financial remuneration model, right? Those third parties that underscore your business are going to have a challenge in obtaining consent. And there's not, I don't think, a clear answer to that at this stage. And that's one of the objectives that the ICON program is set out to do. Those folks that don't have a first-party relationship, let there be a messaging mechanism. And I think it's important that we don't take the incomplete grade that's been issued and to say, I mean, this great quote from John Leibowitz. I would just note that the quote did not continue. And because the customized advertising is not the most important or sensitive thing, we need to pull back the notice mechanisms that have been developed for behavioral advertising. That was a mistake. We need to go backwards. Really, yeah. The intention of the ICON program was never to be complete in its current phase. It was to say, listen, we need a mechanism for conveying complicated information in the third-party context. Now that we have that mechanism, let's see how we can innovate on top of that, fix the user experience issues that have been raised, and leverage it as a platform that stays current with what the current concerns are of the consumer population.
Excellent. So with that, let's take some questions. Go ahead.
I have a question for Duncan. You talked about human subject research consent form.
Yes.
Academia has solved the question of consent to people and how to see that research happen. How do you know when you're doing human subject research and when you're just rifling through people's data? In this business, where is the line drawn between?
Right. So the question is, when you, well, it's all human subjects research. Okay. Anything that involves humans is classified as human subjects research. And I wouldn't actually say that universities have solved this problem because, when I first started doing, web-based experiments, 10 years ago, I sent my, my application to the Columbia's Institutional Review Board, and they had no idea what to do with it, right? Because they were used to dealing with medical science, and so there's all these questions on the form that have to do with are you injecting people with anything? And we're like, no, we're just running a web-based experiment. But so I think that everybody is learning, everybody is having to figure out, where the boundaries are. But okay, the general principle that, there's sort of, I guess there's two kinds of research that I perform, both, at Yahoo and also when I was at Columbia. One is the classic kind of, experimental research, which is sort of like the modern day version of bringing students into the psych lab. And you do the modern day version of reading the informed consent forms to them so they understand what the experiment is about and what they're going to do and what information you're going to collect about them and what the potential harm and benefits are of participating. And then they say, yes, I agree. And so this is sort of very analogous to the terms of service, and you have all the same problems about people not reading it, but you can do your best. And then, at least in theory, you've dealt with the problem, that they've understood what you're doing, and you can even give them tests to make sure that they understand what you're doing, and then they explicitly agree. The other kind of research, which I think is the one that you're referring to, is where you're sort of mining email server logs or something. When you're many years ago, we did another study where we got the email server logs for an entire university community, 40,000 people over a couple of years, and everything. So then you obviously can't do that using informed consent because you know that you'll get an opt-in rate of like less than 1%, and so you might as well not even just do the research. So then the other solution is, well, now you have to blind the data. You have to be able to guarantee that you're not going to identify any person in this data, and so we had to go through a series of fairly rigorous steps and de-identifying and restricting the distribution of the data, and so people still think that that's weird, right? Because you're sort of some of these studies that have come out have been described in the media as tracking tens of thousands of people using their email or their cell phones. But I actually think it's a pretty reasonable solution. Yeah.
Hey, this is Makar. Basically, I'm a mobile solutions architect. So day-to-day what happens, like I used to get location-aware applications, mobile banking solutions to be developed. So I need to rely upon some kind of third-party APIs to be integrated into the application, right? So my worry point is whether I should really rely upon just integrating the APIs, or should I really go ahead and ask what FTCs to say, what legal policies need to say about this, what kind of user experiences I should really bother about.
Can I, as a general principle, and purely a general principle, because it doesn't apply specifically to what you're in, you should always be asking these things. I mean, one of the things, and Michael again has heard me say this for years, that one of the problems with our period as an industry of going underground is we, and I mean everybody, kind of assumed that, oh, this is the lawyer's problem, or this was the public policy person's problem. And it's not. We're all in business. It is a business leadership problem, and in the modern world, we all have to act like leaders. Now, look, I recognize there are constraints, there are different places in the hierarchy, different positions, but I think that until we all assume that we are responsible parties in the user experience for good, and for ill, that we run the risk of not doing the right thing. So I think just I would say as a general principle, be aware, ask the questions. Yes, you can't solve everything. You probably won't be able to solve most things, but you'll at least be able to increase the awareness within your own organization about what the right things are to do.
I could jump in on that. Certainly, when failures happen and companies do things related to privacy that they ask afterwards, why did we do that? How did that happen? It's usually a failure to communicate within the company, where you have an engineer who knew something was happening and the lawyers didn't find out, or the lawyers knew something shouldn't be happening and the engineers didn't find out. One way to protect against this is to think about this like any sort of defensive engineering problem. To try to think about what could go wrong, to try to think what do we really need to do, and to try to think systematically about how we can make a design that's robust from a privacy standpoint. Which means, just like when you rely on somebody's API for some other reason, ask the question, what could go wrong here? What could this code be doing that we don't like? Regardless of what the law says, that's a good practice.
Yeah. So, question I have for anybody. Listening to a lot of the concerns that were expressed throughout the night, there's these long user agreements and privacy policies. People don't want to wade through them. People don't read them even if they're short. They're tough to write. Can't we have default rules? What is so bad about, and something I didn't hear a lot of discussion of, laws? I'm curious to hear people's perspective on why can't we have a more robust privacy law to solve some of these problems, to serve as a default setting, a baseline, because people we know want the privacy protection but don't want to necessarily invest their own time in learning about it. That industry has a lot of questions about what they need to do, that we're concerned about non-democratic decision making by technologists. What do you see as the problem with using the law as a solution?
I'd like to know what Marc will say on this, but I wanted to jump in first to prime the conversation. Law can be a very, very good solution. It could be a much better solution than regulation. The problem with both regulation and law is when they become overly broad, as they have a tendency to do, and they could prescribe large categories of activity that could curtail things you don't want to curtail. The opposite problem also, especially in law, also adheres. You can make things, also regulation too, you can make things so narrow that you create too many opportunities for not just evasion, but not keeping up with technological development. What we've said at IAB from the beginning of this debate was, look, let's identify the harms that we want to prevent and then criminalize or penalize the creation of those harms or the activities that lead to those harms, rather than large categories of activity that might not always lead to harm. At that point, with that preface, Mark, I defer to you.
I just had one response to it, and which is the reason I think law doesn't solve the problem in this particular area effectively is because of the consent exception. That anything we do in terms of law in this area is going to say except with the consent of the user. And then we're going to have a discussion again about what it means to get the consent of the user. Our most restrictive privacy law is the Wiretap Act. And it prevents the interception of communications, review of communications without the consent of the user. It's a 5-year felony. It's got a civil cause of action. People are very worried about the Wiretap Act. But the Wiretap Act has a consent issue, and then a consent exception, and then the question is, well, what happens when Gmail wants to scan mail for content and deliver advertising to you? Did they get consent effectively in their privacy policy, in their terms of service? Federal law has a one-party consent. Some states have a two-party consent. So now they're being sued in Massachusetts because they got the consent of the Google user, but they didn't get the consent of the other user. So I think in any area where you want to give people the right to control their data, and you don't want to say you can never give your data to somebody, then you get the consent, and then we're back in the question of how do you effectively communicate the consent, and law can't design the consent mechanism particularly well any more than the FTC can design the UI mechanism that well. So that would be one thought about why law probably isn't that effective as the solution here.
Other question?
Hi. I don't even know if it's Mark.
It is. Talk loud.
I can talk loudly, that's fine.
Right.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry, I can't project. I've lost my voice. Why do you think technical solutions like the P3P, the platform for privacy preferences, didn't really catch on? Actually physically denying third-party cookies from being set. I mean, I think only Internet Explorer on a high security setting actually uses it. So why do you think something like that wasn't really successful in terms of forcing a machine-readable format of what the data is used for and parsing that in the browser and actually denying them access to a certain functionality that a user hasn't actually approved?
Okay. P3P is actually a really interesting case. I don't think there is uniform agreement about why P3P didn't succeed to the extent that people expected it to. But I've heard a bunch of interesting suggestions about what the issue was. One suggestion is that privacy policies are not just don't just convey information about practices. They're also a vehicle for persuasion. The privacy policy doesn't just say we'll share information with third parties. It says with valued partners. There's the part at the top that says that we care about your privacy and so on. There's nothing in P3P that lets you express we care deeply about your privacy, or we'll only share with certain kinds of third parties, at least not with the level of precision that companies wanted to write. So it proved to be hard to take the very voluminous lawyerese and turn it into a machine-readable format. So that's issue number one. There are also some specific issues about the way it ended up getting implemented. In particular, Internet Explorer, as you said, checked for a P3P policy, but there were some issues with the way that was implemented in Internet Explorer that led to some loopholes that turned out to be widely exploited. And that also limited the spread of P3P. And finally, there's a sort of collective action problem. That it's the kind of system that if most other people are adopting it, then you will feel that you need to as well. But if most other people are not, then you might hold back and wait for others to go first. And P3P didn't get over that hump. So there's a whole set of reasons. And certainly when people talk about any effort to create complicated machine-readable privacy policies. P3P is the first counterexample that's thrown up. How can we do this better this time? It's, I think, a really interesting case of the difficulty of trying to solve a problem like this through purely technical means.
I would just add to that and respond to both the previous questions that whether it's a technical solution or a legal solution, it's difficult for the reason that I brought up in my first comment that depending on the specifics of the context, what people want, what's good for the even if a person had perfect knowledge about the world, they would want different things in different contexts, and it's sort of difficult for any sort of policymaker or lawyer or even engineer to sit down and sort of imagine every possible arrangement of circumstances and what the right solution is for every person in those circumstances. So I don't think that this is an excuse not to try to do the best job we can of making sensible policies and laws and being clear in our terms of services and everything. But I think that the world always defeats us when we try to do that. That things are always going to be more complicated and more contingent than we imagine. So it's never going to solve the problem.
2 questions. Mark, if I give you my business card, can I ask that you not read it out to everyone? Would that be
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Second, global and handling privacy globally. Curious as to the panel in terms of how much you're paying attention. Can regional, or I'll say just in other areas, can those regulation or laws happen there affect us here in the U.S. in terms of how we act? And then can we learn things from other markets? So like in the Netherlands, as I understand it, the publishers got together. 80% of that market has a lot of its regulations already handled because they got together because the laws there in that country are much more strict than where we have.
Well, so Colin and I are both working in this area quite a lot. The answer is yes, it can have an impact. This is this medium, to the degree it's a medium or a channel, is unique in that it is virtually automatically global, frictionlessly. And so policies that are adopted in one venue can very much have an effect in others. In addition to that, Brussels and Washington, in many areas of public policy, have increasingly been signaling each other over the years. Antitrust is a very good example of that, and this is no less an example. There is a great deal of interest in the U.S. about the policies that may or may not be adopted in the EU and eventually implemented in the EU regarding the definitions of opt-in and opt-out and how those are kind of implemented at the national level. Just because of the size of the EU market, there's currently a debate, as you know, going on in the EU between 2 kind of different, you almost want to call them interpretive regimes, but they're really policy regimes. One relating to data security, the other relating to privacy. The one that's been getting most of the attention here is the one that actually relates to data security, and that's the Article 29 Working Party, which is a fairly draconian interpretation of what constitutes affirmative opt-in. Under the privacy regime, it's somewhat looser and much more prone to adopt the industry point of view, which is that browser settings imply consent. So that's a big debate, and will have a real effect on the operations of multinational companies. Now, it's also probably true, and I certainly prefer to add, and others who are more technically, more technically adept, that were that the case maybe it doesn't require kind of global solutions that we would prefer not to adopt in the United States. You can probably, I imagine, you can modify these things based on domain locations and IP addresses and things like that. So, I don't know. But the larger point is it is a point. It is of great interest, and it is of great concern, and it does pinpoint, well, maybe Tom Friedman was quite prescient. The world is quite flat in this area.
Well, sure. So I think to add a little more color there as well, we're talking about the e-privacy directive in the EU, and it's certainly any company that is doing business around the world, as most internet companies are. It's obviously hugely important right now. However, it's also, to be clear, it's only in the early stages of being rolled out. So I think folks who have been following it closely understand it's, if in the EU you pass a law in Brussels, and then every country within the European Union needs to separately roll that law out on their books. We're about 7 or 8 countries in to the deployment of that law throughout the European Union. So it's in early phases still. However, there's no question that the regulators in Europe intend to take that law very seriously, and that for right now it's law in France, it's law in the UK, it will shortly be law in the Netherlands and Germany and Spain, right? So anybody from a pragmatic operational planning standpoint should bear in mind that it either is law or is about to be law in the vast majority of advertising markets and internet technology markets throughout Europe. The key pivot, though, is how one word is going to be interpreted, and that's consent. What we know is that in the European Union, you're going to have to get consent to track consumer behavior. That applies to more than the online behavioral advertising practices that the U.S. Has sort of tasked itself to solve. And it really applies to almost any tracking conduct outside of shopping carts and basic sort of website functionality. And the two sort of opposing factions right now in the regulatory community are, on one side, folks saying that consent must be prior consent, effectively an opt-in interpretation, or consent in certain cases could be sort of passive or implied consent. That isn't resolved yet. Probably will be resolved over the next 6 to 12 months as other sort of regulatory opinions are published and industry does or does not demonstrate good passive consent models in the marketplace. And how that unfolds is truly going to have an impact, sort of fallback impact, on how things evolve in the US and also when Asia and the rest of sort of the world sort of comes online with their regimes as well.
Thanks for taking my question. Coming from an advertising perspective, I'm one of those guys that does the laser targeted ads. We always try to do things in the best interest of the end user. But I'm curious where the role and the responsibility lies of disclosing use and then use and storage of even anonymous data that isn't directly tied to a person, doesn't have a name, but it has a lot of demographic information. So I'm curious, is it up to the advertiser or the distribution network or both? Where does the responsibility lie and possibly the legality of doing these kind of very targeted advertisements? Thank you.
So in general, the responsibility is wonderfully diffuse. Right? So policy tends to be set at the level of the company that is engaged in the collection or use of that data. Which from the policymaker's perspective is always very elegant, right? So if you're doing it, then you must disclose it. The challenge from a technologist's perspective is that in the typical ad impression, you have multiple parties that are involved. You can have the advertiser, a network, sort of multiple data aggregators, and the reality is that ultimately every one of those participants is accountable for ensuring that notice and in certain cases consent have been obtained. So there are various ways that you can take control of that situation, but unfortunately there's no party that's individually held accountable, and therefore no set of parties that can basically disown accountability. And that plays out certainly in the U.S. self-regulatory program, has been borne out by some case law, and it is likely to be replicated in the EU as well.
In addition to these issues of notice and consent, there are also issues of data security, meaning that if you have information about users that you're storing or using, that you have a responsibility to give it an appropriate level of protection, appropriate in light of how much data, how sensitive, and the circumstances generally. Protection against either an intrusion or internal misuse that leads to harm of consumers. And that's another factor to take into account.
Yeah, I think it's listening to what you guys have said tonight. If law is not really, let's say, a way to deal with this efficiently, isn't there still a danger in allowing the companies that benefit from the collection of this data to regulate or at least set their own policies into how this is collected? Because I mean, whether we're burying 10 pounds of legal text at the bottom of the page or implanting an icon in the middle of an advertisement, all of the solutions so far seem to be business serving rather than consumer serving, and that we're trying to find a way to allow the business to continue to operate efficiently rather than really giving the consumer an effective choice. And the 90 billion icons with a 0.0002% click rate to me just seems...
Well, but again, I go back, and this is where I disagree with Mark. If you take a harm standard, and that law can be a very effective means of, now, you still have other issues there, which is how do you police it, okay, when there's so much going on. In the end, one of the values or virtues of self-regulation is it actually encourages competitors to rat on each other. And the Council of Better Business Bureaus, which is our compliance mechanism for this self-regulatory program, will tell you that in all the other self-regulatory programs that it manages for industry, that is the biggest arena of complaint. It is competitors turning each other in. So
I would add to that. First of all, the 0.0002, that was opt-out, not engage with the icon. So I think, and frankly, the click-through rate of the icon is actually very comparable to click-through rates on advertisements, right? So in other words, folks are about as prone to engage in advertising as they are the privacy messaging around that advertising. I think if we were to go too far in the other direction, right, you get a much more meaningful, meaty indicator of user engagement, which would suggest that advertisers are paying for advertising that is, 100 to 1, a bridge to privacy messaging instead of sort of marketing material. That's probably not going to be sustainable. But I don't think that what we're talking about are systems that are designed solely for commercial benefit. I think that many folks, certainly we would acknowledge that there is a role for regulation and for law. The point is not, there shouldn't be any law and businesses ought to be able to run amok. I mean, that's going to catch up with the responsible companies in the industry. They don't want that either. There clearly is a role for various parties, some of them governmental, to be holding sort of bad conduct accountable. I also think that when you're looking at legal standards, you frequently run into challenges where consumers, we're talking about what would be sort of the consumer's interests, are continuously making decisions that would seem to run counter to standards that you might otherwise mandate, right? So, for example, just take something very clear, like a consumer ought to have the right to opt out of tracking. And we have a free application, GoStory. It's been downloaded 4.5 million times. People use it to identify third parties on websites and carte blanche block all tracking activity from those third parties. They can do it for free at any point in time. Folks download it, folks block companies, and they frequently object to the fact that services that they want to engage in are now being blocked. Why is that, right? And it has to do with this sort of complicated bargaining that's happening behind the scenes, and it's one of the reasons that very rough instruments have a way of frustrating not just commercial activity, but consumer choice. Because consumers frequently object to the impact of those decisions because they don't fully understand them, or because those decisions, as Duncan illustrated, are highly contextual, right? Like, I don't want anybody to be able to do certain things with my data at all, and that ought to be illegal, unless it's Facebook or Google. And you start to carve out these exceptions, and then what does the law look like, right? I mean, the law ends up looking like, nobody can do any of these things unless you're one of the top internet companies in the world. Or so things just get so nuanced so quickly that it just frequently happens that the law tends not to be the most sensitive instrument to fulfill either consumer or commercial interests.
And just to clarify the point I was alleged making earlier, I wasn't saying the law doesn't work. I was saying we were already having a discussion within the context of a very powerful, very strong law, which is the Wiretap Act, and we're still trying to figure out what does that law mean. And there are other areas where we have stricter laws, like Social Security numbers, where we can't you have to dispose of it in a certain way and handle it in a certain way, and we're not talking about that kind of data here, so that's why my response was, I'm not sure that the law is the solution to this particular problem.
I took advantage of you, and I apologize.
Let me also add that that even for handling of ordinary consumer data, the law does play an important role. Mark talked earlier about the Sears matter that the FTC that involved FTC enforcement. There are lots of examples of FTC enforcement in the privacy area of existing law. Many of them are around data security companies failing to protect data that they are holding adequately. There are cases about deceptive practices. There are cases about companies not keeping their promises to consumers. And one of the things that law can do in this area is to backstop self-regulation. So that if a company takes a pledge that they are following a self-regulatory code, and then in a deceptive manner violates that, the FTC would be interested, and you might well see enforcement. And that's a way in which companies can voluntarily agree to be legally bound. And I think that's an important mechanism, which both allows the industry to come to its own, industry and other stakeholders together to come to a self-regulatory solution that could be the right protection for consumers while having the backstop of law behind it.
Which, by the way, commercial for the IAB, we did do this year. We passed an IAB code of conduct that incorporates these privacy principles, and that expressly provides a legally binding agreement between our members and, in effect, the FTC, that they will abide by these principles. So they are under kind of an enhanced, what's the word here? They're operating under an enhanced threat that if they violate these principles, they can have bad things done to them by the government.
I'll just sort of add to that, your question, and maybe I misunderstood it, but it seemed to me like there was a presumption there that the relationship that companies have with data is an exploitative one. The private businesses are collecting data about consumers, and they're making it difficult for them to understand what they're collecting because they want to somehow exploit it in a way that's good for them, and they don't care about the consumer. But I think actually that's mostly not true, right? I think that if you think about cookies, for example, what were cookies invented for? They were not invented to track people, as they moved across the internet. They were invented to so that you could have a shopping cart that would remember you, right? That they were invented to actually sort of improve the user experience. And I think that even though companies probably do think about their own interests when they're designing their products, they really think about the interest of the consumer, because that's how they're going to make money. If they provide a good consumer experience, then they're going to outcompete the competition. And so I think that most of the focus is actually in trying to build really good products that people want to use and want to engage with, and you collect information because you think that it's going to help you build better, more appealing products, not because you're just interested in exploiting the data for its own sake. So it doesn't mean that there's no tension there. Absolutely, and that's been clear all along tonight that there is this tension, and all the solutions that we've discussed are still relevant. But I think it's important to sort of keep in mind that companies are not necessarily, certainly not primarily, and maybe not so much at all, motivated by exploitation as they are by actually consumer experience.
Hi. I have a question about privacy policy updates. I think we've all been in the situation where you use a service, you like it, you agree to it, then you get an email or a little pop-up window saying the terms of use have changed. To continue, you must agree, and you get 40,000 words of legal text with no indication of what's standard boilerplate versus what's maybe something new that you might object to. Even if you are reasonably intelligent and intent on doing your due diligence, I think it's pretty difficult to tease out what's new, and of course we realize that most internet users are neither reasonably intelligent nor do they do their due diligence. So I guess my question to the panel, to everyone really, is what do you think are best practices in terms of informing users about changes, and what can the industry do, hopefully in terms of self-regulation, to kind of make it clearer and easier for users to understand when their privacy policies have changed and what those changes are?
Well, I think as a means of communicating in a simple manner to consumers, as sort of a platform for consumer messaging, terms of service and privacy policies are generally regarded as being somewhat defunct. Right? I mean, they still serve a very meaningful value in that they constitute a contract between the consumer and the website operator or the application developer. There are means for some of the snitching that Randall indicated before. I mean, if you violate your privacy policy or terms of service, it is quite possible that your competitor is going to discover that and use that against you. It is quite possible that a regulator is going to notice that and be able to enforce against you. So they do have a valid purpose. But as far as sort of them being viewed as a consumer messaging vehicle, I think it's commonly accepted that they serve very little meaningful role at this stage. Which is to say that going back to this this view of the responsible commercial operator that is engaging in a fundamental shift in the value proposition as it relates to data and the consumer ought to engage in messaging that is taken out of the terms and service and privacy agreement and brought forward in a manner that is more in the domain of the user experience designer, right? And that's also where we're going in the area of transparency, where I was saying before that transparency increasingly does not mean here's a new opportunity for us to slam the user with terms of service changes. Transparency means there's sort of a new model for coming forward with disclosures that are simple, that are bulleted, and that are not seen as a legal document and are designed from sort of a marketer and product UI perspective.
I actually only agree with half of that. I don't agree that privacy policies are useless in communicating to consumers. I was explaining, I think why they've become so long and cumbersome, but I don't think they're useless, and I think your question brings out the way in which they're most useful, which is the FTC has provided some useful guidance that when you change a privacy policy and you're going to change the way you're going to use information that was already collected, that is something that you need to call out and get express consent for, compared to a privacy policy that changes the way in which future data will be used, in which case most companies aren't calling that out, in part because the FTC doesn't require it and there's no legal requirement they do so. Best practice, which is what you asked about, is to call out the summary of all changes before the privacy policy, and to even keep both policies online, one in a red line form for a period of 30 days so that consumers can see the changes and decide if they want to opt in. That's best practice. It's not common practice. But when it comes to the issue of material changes, I think the law has provided some insight, certainly FTC has through their enforcement actions, that should be called out in some way if it's going to be a material retroactive change to the way information that was already collected is going to be used.
We're going to take two, maybe three more questions and try to move through them pretty quickly.
Well, I really enjoyed the discussion this evening, but I have a very strong sense of deja vu, in the sense that much of the arguments, the points that have been debated, this has been the same context for the last 15 years in the privacy debate. We've heard a lot about the self-regulation, whether it's working, whether it's not working. Some would have very different take on why P3P failed, why the NAI failed, associated with the lack of regulatory interest. It's there, industry promotes it. As long as there's a threat of regulation, the threat of regulation goes away, the effort fails. In a sense, a lot of what we're talking about tonight, I think, is fitting into this cycle. We're in sort of let's try it, we're in the amorphous stage, the norms are changing, the cultural area is changing. It's likely down the pike we'll see some law come out to a greater degree. There's something unique, I think, in our current environment that I didn't hear anything about on the panel tonight, and that's the blending between the public sector uses, government surveillance, law enforcement uses, and private sector data collection and private sector uses. And I think in particular, with location services, we're going to see much more of this. And Mark, you mentioned ECFA. I mean, ECFA is traditionally protection against the government. How do you see in this space the role that app developers, the roles and responsibilities of app developers in the context that there's a lot of bleed between private sector held data and what the government is now seeking by buying it, not necessarily subpoenaing it? How do you see that playing out? We didn't think there any discussion on that.
Well, I want to challenge one of your premises, which is that all this has failed. I'm not challenging your premise that it's deja vu all over again. From the perspective of, remember, we're here to talk about advertising and behavioral advertising, which I've said from the beginning of this discussion, and everybody has agreed, is pretty much the non-issue relative to all the other issues that we could be discussing. From the perspective of consumer complaint and consumer complaint, let alone consumer concern, self-regulation has not failed, it succeeded. There are no consumer complaints. And there are very, well, hey, yeah, actually, the last thing that I saw that the CDT did on this, which was a roll-up of all the complaints filed with states' attorneys general over a period of 3 years, found 0 complaints relating to behavioral or targeted advertising. It found 1 complaint in all 50 states relating to privacy, and that was already covered by COPA. So, I mean, I don't know if they've updated that since then, but they're relative to other areas of complaint which are pretty severe. Nigerian scams, actually spam is I think the largest area of complaint.
We've just seen $30 million paid out in consumer litigation for privacy violations.
I'm sorry?
We've just seen $30 million paid out by 3 companies or 4 companies.
But not in the area of behavioral targeting that is covered by the self-regulatory program. There are many, many other areas that deserve to be addressed and deserve to be discussed. I completely agree with you. Again, I laid my cards on the table. I'm a progressive liberal Democrat raised in the New Jersey suburbs. I think one of the gravest areas of concern is, and this is traditional in the United States, is government encroachment on citizens' privacy. And yes, it absolutely is an area of concern, the degree to which the law allows the government to reach into private businesses, to grab that kind of material. This has certainly and demonstrably grown worse since 2001. But it wasn't the area that we were kind of asked to cover. So yeah, it's something that's of concern, ought to be looked at, but it's divergent really from the issues relating to behavioral advertising.
I guess I wasn't here to talk about behavioral advertising, so I did think it was broader, and I touched a little bit on this, but what I think the point you're making is a good one, in the sense that the government is relying increasingly on the terms of service and the disclosures that consumers are making to businesses to say you can't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in things that you share across the internet. It's one of the things that's going on with the ECPA reform debate in Washington as to whether ECPA should be reformed to provide more protection to information stored in the cloud, regardless of what the terms of service said. And you're probably as familiar as I am with the 2 cases where the government has argued in Warshak in one of them, where they said that terms of service that allow Google to look at mail means that Google needs to produce content on something less than a search warrant, or other providers' terms of service means that they don't need a search warrant because the user consented. And the courts have found so far that the consents haven't been so broad that they allow the government to piggyback on them. And I think in location data, we're going to have a real issue with that, because the more we share location data voluntarily, the harder it is to maintain these new cases that say otherwise, if it's not shared, the government needs a warrant. But it's a really good point, and it was the point I was trying to make when we were talking about the schizophrenia we have with data, is that we want it to be protected by the government, but the more we voluntarily agree to share it with corporations and with others, the less likely it is to be protected by the government, from the government.
One last question. Okay. In the back half of the panel discussion, you kind of touched on questions of scale and the sort of exploded panopticon that can arise when you have a large enough cross-reference data set. And I was curious if the industry had anything that they were looking to address scale specifically as opposed to data retention or persistence.
Certainly the issue has come up quite a lot, and it's been debated and discussed both in the Congress and at the FTC. At this point, I think we are not doing anything relative to this in the self-regulatory program, because we're still involved in getting the self-regulatory program itself to scale and getting some of the technical issues worked out and improved. And I think, and this is just a guess, I defer to some of the others on the panel, I think that, well, I guess I think 2 things. One is that data retention standards are hard to set universally, because what do we mean when we use the word data? What kind of data? What kind of information? Secondly, I think that may be an area that needs to be and wants to be discussed and debated among legislators, regulators, industry, and consumers, because it is one of the areas where you don't want to be so broad that you throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to be so narrow as to be irrelevant and allow all manner of evasion. But I kind of defer to others here.
I mean, I just want to sort of, something else we haven't really talked about tonight, which relates to your question, is the conversation and the questions have sort of all, again, implicitly sort of made this assumption that the companies can, that the storage is no problem and that the retention is no problem, right? That we sort of, that the data sort of goes out there and it stays there forever, and companies can make perfect sense of it and do anything they want with it, and actually it's a massive technical problem, right? That the amount of data that's being generated now is sort of terabytes per day. I mean, I don't know what the the exact analogy is, but if you take all the information that humankind has produced in up until 1980, that much is generated every week or something crazy like that, right? So the actual sort of the scale of the server farms that have to be built just to hold all this stuff, there's sort of we have to really think very hard about what we actually want to keep, because it's really expensive to memory is getting cheap and everything, but it's still very expensive and difficult to store all this stuff indefinitely. And then, making sense of it is actually a highly, non-trivial problem. So it's not the case that everyone knows everything about you, because, so that, we sort of worry a lot about, what people can do with the data, but we might also worry about people not being able to retain it. That stuff that we might want companies to keep is going to get lost. That useful products may not get developed because the relevant data is not being maintained and is not being sort of cross-referenced in a useful kind of way.
I think scale does two things. Increasing scale does two things. One is it raises the stakes. The consequences of a data breach are worse if you have a larger scale of data, and that means that you have to do more to protect against a breach. And the other thing, as Duncan said, is that it becomes harder to figure out what might be inferred from the data. And that means that it becomes harder to make statements like this data is de-identified, this data is anonymous, and so on. Terms like anonymous are, if you say data is anonymous, you're making a specific technical claim. And I think at least as a best practice, you ought not to be making that claim unless you can back it up. And it becomes harder to reason about those things as the scale increases.
I can't speak for the industry as a whole, but I can speak for what some of the clients of systems like ours are thinking about when thinking about scale. And I think it's a really good question. I think that, first of all, it really hinges on notice and it hinges on choice, right? So one of the pieces here is that you need to be able to scale a decision to opt out, for example, across the entire industry. And that becomes complicated technically, and there are multiple efforts that are underway to unify that decision so that I can make one decision to opt out, for example, or to opt out of tracking in another context, and to sort of pull in technical systems that communicate that and ensure that it's honored in a scaled fashion across the industry. You can look at sort of unified opt-out tools like the ones that we provide behind the icons. You can look at sort of tools like Ghostery. You can look at efforts that have been underway to create a header-based system, all of which is designed to scale a decision. The other piece that is around consent, and in particular in the areas of third parties, the way that a single consent decision, in many ways, this is one of the tensions that we come into very quickly when we say that we need to have very simplified interfaces, very simplified decision-making criteria around, for example, the provision of consent. And the challenge there is that as you start to try to scale that decision, you reach diminishing ability to actually have meaning in that decision. So if the decision is, for example, I'm okay with third-party cookies, I'm okay with third-party tracking, I'm okay with the industry doing certain things, that decision quickly scales out instead of to dozens to hundreds of companies with widely varying business practices and intent with respect to that data. And it's one of the reasons that we think it's actually really important to continue to provide context around that decision over time so that you don't sort of over-infer sort of a scaled consent decision when that's really not appropriate given the scale and the varying degrees of use in the market.
All right, well, that's the last question. A lot to think about, a lot more to discuss in future panels. Let's have a round of applause for the panelists, and thank you all very much. And I think there's drinks next door.